We are in this inflection point in human history that humanity is being transformed by these technologies, but very few people get a voice in deciding how the technologies get deployed, what kinds of major structural changes we're making to our societies. And I am particularly concerned that we have bottom-up voices, that we have more participation in those conversations than we have today. But how we get from here to there is not so clear to me. I also want to say one thing about you talked almost pejoratively about soft law. I am a proponent of soft law because I think the speed of digital transformation undermines our ability to put in place hard law quickly enough, and therefore sometimes soft law is at least a good first step. For those who don't know that term, it's really referring to standards, laboratory practices and procedures, insurance policies, a whole plethora of mechanisms that can be useful, but they very seldom have any enforcement behind them. So I take it to mean that when you are talking a bit pejoratively about soft law, it's that concern that without enforcement mechanisms, it's hard to know whether we're going to get any effective governance at all. Am I correct on that?
Absolutely. No, you are. And you know, Wendell, one of the things that really spooks me right now is how successful, and with their multi-million-dollar investment, big industry, big tech is in lobbying politics. You know, politicians to not actually do their job. And what disturbs me mostly about this is that democracy is at stake here. And I don't think that, you know, I mean, I've read lots of multinational big tech companies, and they're doing quite good stuff, at least on the surface, in relation to checking the ethnicity or the ethical dimension of the new tools they're developing and so on. But when you then look at who is part of their internal governance board on this, there's not one single worker on there. And this is why, you know, I keep on saying that, you know, when we look at the principles of transparency or auditability or fairness, we have to ask transparent to whom, fair for whom. And there's no way that a junior legal compliance officer in the company can answer that question truthfully. Therefore, we need people around the table. And yes, you know, to govern this, to put these practices in place, to put the public institutions in place to actually enforce these principles, this will take time, but then maybe we actually deserve towards ourselves and our peers to hurry up a little bit slowly here.
Well, let's say a corporation took you up on that and they said, okay, we would like a spokesperson for user concerns. And let's say they go beyond that and they say user concerns, worker concerns. How do you propose they go about figuring out who that member of their board could be? I mean, where do they turn to for representation? Because my experience has been that there's kind of a top-down paternalism where we see various voices representing workers, underserved communities, women, indigenous communities, small nations, but it's largely the same people. And though I love some of the people who are in that role, there are others who I feel like that are just placeholders. So it seems to me we need to create some kind of network where we at least make available those who we think can engage in bottom-up representation, but also will be trustworthy within the constraints, for example, that a board of directorship of a corporation would want.
Well, absolutely, and I really want to support you on, you know, the need to open up these conversations, to bring in far more voices. I think a lot of the criticism that has been raised around, you know, the white man / now and again a woman, discussing these things is very valid. Now, but in the workplace, if we look at how could we govern some of these technologies that, you know, the monitoring and surveillance of workers, how could we govern them in the workplaces? Well, you know, that's why we have unions. So you have a lot of shop stewards, as it's called in some parts of the world, staff reps in other parts of the world, who are there elected to represent the wider group of workers or employees. So again, this is another reason why actually to join a union, to actually have that seat at the table and have that representation, which is a democratic representation. So if you're not satisfied with what your staff reps are saying, well, then it's open for discussion, of course. In relation to the wider world, how do we make sure that we are inclusive and diverse? I think this is a job, of course, of all of us. So if we're ever hosting an event, to make sure that we are inviting a diverse group of people, but also that we hold our governments and our companies accountable to whatever tool that they are developing. Well, how's about making an impact assessment, and not just an impact assessment along narrow lines, but on broader lines. And again, to be able to do that, they will need to engage in dialogue with how could this affect indigenous groups or underserved communities or the global south and so forth. You know, to think that we have all the answers as office people sat in Silicon Valley, I think would be very wrong. Now, I'm being a bit harsh here, but I hope you understand what I mean. But for sure, you know, again, this is about hurrying up slowly to get the mechanisms in place, and honestly, to break some of the myths that have been created. I mean, a couple of years ago, I gave a speech actually invited by one of the big tech companies. They'd never had a unionist inside their doors before. And when I was presented, I could hear somebody in the room go, oh, a union person. And I picked up on that and said, you know, so I heard that, but let's talk afterwards. And afterwards, he was like, oh, I didn't know the unions had this point of views. I didn't. And I think a lot of this conflict, a lot of the antagonism between us is built on myths and built on misunderstandings that we really should sit down and talk about.